Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for this discussion about the economic impact of COVID-19 and the policy implications for developing economies. My name is Ceyla Pazarbaşoğlu. I'm the Vice President for Equitable Growth, Finance and Institutions at the World Bank Group. I'm joined by two very distinguished panelists, Mohamed El-Arian, the Chief Economic Advisor of Allianz, and Raghu Rajan, the Professor of Finance at the University of Chicago. Thank you both for joining us today virtually, Mohamed and Raghu. I really look forward to the discussion. We have a large audience from across the world joining via Facebook, YouTube, World Bank Live. Please do post your questions online and we will try to respond towards the end of the session. We are in the midst of a pandemic and a global recession that have no parallel in modern times. World Bank Group resources are being scaled up dramatically to support countries as they are fighting with this pandemic. We recently reached a milestone by quickly implementing programs in over 100 developing countries. In these times of very unprecedented uncertainty, high-frequency monitoring and rigorous analytical work are really necessary to inform policy debates. At the bank, we have been closely monitoring developments and assessing the impact of the combined health and economic crisis. Yesterday, we published the analytical chapters of the Global Economic Prospects Report, GEP, as we call it. This is our biannual flagship report on the state of the global economy. We will release the full report next week along with the growth forecast, but we already published yesterday the analytical chapters, which are titled Lasting Scars of the COVID-19 Pandemic and Adding Fuel to the Fire. I urge you to take a look at them as they provide important insights based on rigorous analytical work and in-depth comprehensive studies. So let me start with three key takeaways from this work that we will be discussing today. First, this is a uniquely deep recession triggered solely by a pandemic and the actions to contain it. The prolonged recession of 1917-1921 was partly driven by the Spanish flu, but also the aftermath of World War I. So we are really on uncharted territory. The virus has delivered an enormous shock, leading to collapse in economic activity and oil prices and record capital outflows. Measures needed to protect public health have undercut an already fragile economy and causing deep recessions across all countries, something that we have not seen since World War II. Second, the spillovers are enormous. The most vulnerable economies are those with weak health systems, but also developing countries that are heavily reliant on global trade, commodity exports, tourism, or on capital flows and remittances from abroad. Travel and transport account for about 2/3 of oil consumption. The sharp decline in travel and transport, as well as other energy-using activities, has led to a collapse in oil demand with major implications for many of the oil exporting developing countries. Third is that we have seen so far every recession leads to decline in potential output in developing economies, those that are impacted, and the COVID-19 recession will likely leave even deeper long-term economic scars. There are two key features of this current global recession: the higher likelihood of financial crisis, as well as the severe terms of trade shock to energy exporters that really increase the potential for lasting damage. To give you some examples, 5 years after the average recession, potential output was almost 6% below baseline in developing economies. A recession combined with a financial crisis lowered potential output by almost 8% over 5 years, and a recession that combines with an oil price plunge lowered potential output by 11% on average for energy exporting developing countries. So on top of all these factors that we have seen in recent recessions, we have other factors that are unique to this crisis: the sharp increase in uncertainty, lower investment and innovation, erosion of human capital, and the potential retreat from global supply and trade linkages. So the bottom line is that most emerging and developing economies that started this crisis with high vulnerabilities. We had record levels of sovereign and corporate debt. They have been hit by a great shock, compounded by spillovers from advanced economies in China, and they have limited and constrained policy space to respond. And this makes it very likely that we will experience, most of these countries will experience a sharp and protracted decline in potential growth. So I guess the key question for us is, first, let's start with the immediate policies. So what should developing countries do to limit the immediate harm? Many advanced economies, as well as several developing countries, have taken extraordinary policy measures, including quantitative easing, large fiscal stimulus packages. Globally, fiscal actions and stimulus packages amount to $9 trillion. So these are very large numbers. So Mohammed, maybe if you could tell us, you mentioned recently that central banks, and in this case Fed, can help us through liquidity crisis, can help market functioning, and can help through credit, but it cannot help through bankruptcy. Can you tell us a little bit more what you have in mind with this, and what this means for developing economies in terms of what to do and what not to do? Over to you.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me, and it's a pleasure to be with you and with Raghu and with everybody on this call. I think you've put forward the scale of the shock really well. And I'm going to come back to why it's even more complicated than what you suggested, as hard as that is. It hit China, it hit Korea, it hit Japan, and it hit the US first. And there was a playbook. And the playbook was first and foremost about relief. You lock down, you deal with the inconsistency between health and the economy by sacrificing livelihood for lives. Then once you have some your arms around it, you start the second phase that we're in, living with COVID. Looking forward to a third phase, which is overcoming COVID through either vaccine or community immunity. The first phase is relief. Major emphasis on relief, major emphasis on stopping liquidity problems from becoming solvency problems. And the mindset is whatever it takes, all in, whole of government. Now, go to developing countries. And within this, of course, the Fed does incredible things. And not only does it support market functioning, not only does it support liquidity, but it also supports credit risk and default risk, which is very new for the Federal Reserve. Take to a developing country. The first thing they do is they get hit, most of them get hit first by the spillovers, and then second by the infections. A lot of us were very impressed, happy, relieved that in the first phase, very few developing countries got hit. Now Latin America is at the epicenter, accounting for over 40% of the cases, and there's a concern that this is the third phase of the infection. But so far, most emerging markets, most developing economies have been dealing with the first phase, which is the spillover. Lower export volumes, lower export prices, lower remittances, lower tourism, lower foreign direct investment, you just name it, they got hit. And what we have found out, that policy space is limited. You cannot deploy fiscal and monetary policy for the simple reason that most of your debt and a lot of your expenses are in foreign currency. So you sacrifice something. And we have seen countries sacrifice a combination of three things: their reserves, their exchange rate, or their debt by borrowing more. And markets have been wide open for most countries so far. That means that unlike the developing country, unlike the advanced economies, and I think this is a key point, you cannot neatly put a dividing line between lives and livelihood. You've got to find a better way to mix it. You cannot put a good dividing line between resilience and agility. You have to do both. And that requires a lot of learning. It requires a lot of support from the international community and a lot of support from private creditors. Otherwise, reconciling and finding that balance is going to prove very difficult.
I'll come back to you on the three issues you mentioned, especially in terms of learning support from international community and the private creditors. But I'd like to hear also from Raghu. You wrote about this also in the FT, Raghu, that companies cannot be simply woken up from their coma, and you talked about hard choices. So what is your view in terms of what can be done and what is needed to get through this crisis? You need to unmute.
I always forget this. Well, first, thanks for having me, and no thanks for having me come after Mohammed. He's always a very hard act to follow. I wanted to say a couple of things about developed countries, and then let me come to developing and emerging markets. I think the playbook, the ideal playbook for both is really a five-part program. First, contain the virus. Second, offer relief for those who are affected, the people who have to stay at home who don't have livelihoods, but also small and medium enterprises. Third is repair the parts of the economy that desperately need repair. Sometimes it is the financial sector, as you pointed out. The fourth is recovery. How do we, especially with the high levels of unemployment that are expected, create the animal spirits that create recovery? Some people think it's a no-brainer. Just open up and everything will come back, and maybe they're right. But maybe you need a little bit of a virtuous circle, and that would require some amount of stimulus. And the last, of course, for many emerging markets in developing countries is the reforms that are needed given the post-COVID world, given that many of the elements that they depended on in the past may have changed somewhat, including trade and tourism. So this is the playbook. And as Mohammed pointed out, the resources to run this playbook in full are very limited, even with the industrial countries. I mean, this is immensely costly, keeping people at home for a couple of months. In the United States, the borrowing this quarter is likely to be approximately $3 trillion or 15% of GDP. I mean, no emerging market has the ability to spend that much. In fact, very, very few industrial countries have the ability to spend that much. And that's only in the first phase, that is, of keeping people at home. What if there is a recurrence, a second wave, so to speak? A lot of people are discounting it, and maybe they're right, but maybe there's a second phase. And of course, there's the phase of stimulus, if we need to stimulate the economy back to growth. So the point I was making in that article is the view that we can, in a sense, completely buffer the economy, put it to sleep, and wake it up in order for it to walk out of bed fully intact, is becoming harder to maintain, especially as this crisis drags on, which then means we have to be a lot more clever about how we spend money. You can't protect every entity, you can't keep it as if nothing happened. There has to be pain that has to be absorbed. Some of it will be with the financial creditors, the debt, the equity. Some of it will be the government, but the government has limited resources, so it has to pick and choose. And this is in spades for the developing countries and emerging markets. You cannot bail out every company. You have to preserve some bailout money for the financial sector, which may need it, which probably has a greater multiplier effect than corporations, which means that many corporations may have to be run through a bankruptcy process. And as we know, the existing bankruptcy processes in many emerging markets, let alone developing countries, is fairly long, costly, and is not something you can run firms through quickly. So these are things we need to start considering, especially because there are, this time around, a lot of good firms, viable firms, but that are financially unviable because they've had to spend money staying alive during the crisis. They had a lot of debt beforehand. And if we are to prevent them from closing down permanently, we really need to find quick ways of restructuring their liabilities. Let me stop there.
But that's really insightful from both of you. I mean, I guess what we are all struggling with is We have all managed crises in the past, and usually you come to a crisis, you know what has happened, you look at, you do a diagnostic, you decide what your strategy is, and you implement it. And some do it well, and some not so well. But at the end of the day, you can come up and design a strategy to deal with the problems that one inherits or the problems that one is in. In this case, the problem is it's just so much uncertainty and so much, whether it's a first wave or second wave, so much unknown. It makes it very difficult to come up with a diagnostic of, like you said, who is viable, who is not viable, when to support, how to support. And in that context, I think it would be really useful to hear from yourselves. We discussed this at another forum with you, Raghu, as to if you have limited resources and you want to keep some form of corporate sector alive after this crisis, you can't just let everyone go under. Then there has to be some way of deciding how to allocate one's limited resources. One idea was to look at past year's tax revenues and support the SMEs, but it would be great to hear from both of you as to how can one target efforts when one has such limited space? How do you prioritize? There are so many issues to address, and we don't even know if we are end of it. We don't even know what is coming on our way 2 months, 3 months down the road. So how does one prioritize and come up with advice? On the issue of insolvency, clearly, this is an issue that we care a lot about at the World Bank. The bank is actually a standard setter together with UNCITRAL on insolvency, and we are one of the biggest provider of financial and technical assistance to developing countries in terms of insolvency practices, including out-of-court settlement systems or quick implementable measures. Even then, though, it takes time to implement these reforms, but also know how to target, how to prioritize. So maybe I can start with you now, Raghu, and then with Mohammed on, when you have limited resources, how do you prioritize?
Sure. I think the first thing is you need to try and figure out what are the entities that are going to be valuable in terms of creating jobs, in terms of creating value, while what are the entities that it's good to have, but if they close down now, something which is a close substitute can open up shortly after. The first would be, say, mid-sized firms, 100, 150 people, have manufacturing facilities, have some reputation for quality, and have been in the business for a number of years. There's a lot of organizational capital. There's a lot of know-how embedded in there. Starting those up quickly may be very, very difficult once they've closed and have let go their workers and have the plant and machinery are under bankruptcy. On the other hand, the small restaurant at the corner, that's something that opens and shuts all the time. And for sure, we should find ways to protect the workers in those restaurants. But if it shuts down, well, if there's a need for restaurants once COVID is fully behind us, of that kind, well, they will start up. So I would distinguish first between these. The political instinct is to support all the small guys. In fact, it may be the small guys are the easiest to start up. It's more important to preserve credit for them when they want to start up again. But at this point, just putting more money into them is probably not necessary. Then you have the really big guys, and some of them also are in difficulty, but they can go through an accelerated bankruptcy process without losing value. Again, it differs from EM to EM, but this is where the government has to work very hard on creating an accelerated bankruptcy process such that the big guys can be passed through them, the big guys that are in difficulty. So what you really focus then on is the medium-sized guys, the 100, 150 person firm, and there's some mix of attempts at restructuring, but those may be costly to those entities, as well as some potential support from the government if it has resources. might be most valuable. Again, within this class of firms, as you said, tax-paying firms are firms in which the government effectively has a stake, but it also allows the government to have a transparent metric of who will be helped to what extent. So, for example, you could say the government is willing to guarantee loans to these firms up to the extent of, say, the taxes they've paid for the last 3 years. It's willing to take that amount of first loss, for example. So those could be ways you could structure this in an objective way, and with transparent tax records, banks will know who they can lend to, and it's based on viability before the crisis. Of course, that doesn't assure viability after the crisis, but it's certainly a non-subjective way of doing it. So I think we need to think about all this in as clever a way as possible. As you said, speed is important, but is hard to achieve. But failing that, we're going to have a lot of firms with enormous amounts of debt and essentially stuck because they won't get new funding because they will need new funding to, for working capital, etc., but simply will not find it. And governments are really too strapped to help in many cases.
Yeah, and this is a topic would be good to talk a little bit more. And what started as a health crisis turned into an economic crisis. And I think the biggest concern that I have is it then turns into a health, economic, and financial crisis, which has huge implications and sets countries very far back, and debt is a key component of this. Unfortunately, many countries started this with record high debt levels, both for the sovereign and the corporate, and hiding these guarantees or stimulus in either SOE balance sheets through arrears or on state banks' balance sheets through loans to firms that may not make it, is not going to prepare them well at all for a recovery. It's actually going to create much bigger problems and potentially even major debt problems that we may have. This is an agenda which is really very important to us, both as sustainability, but also debt transparency, which we have been working very hard on. I'd like to come back to that. But going to you, Mohammed, any thoughts as to how to prioritize when you have limited resources?
So because I agree with what Raghu said, I will just add one micro issue and then take it to a macro discussion. On the micro issue, I would just also stress the importance of human productivity. Health and education are really important. When you talk about scars, that is where the scar can be the most painful socially, economically. So I can't stress enough the importance of health and education. It's not just a straightforward thing. We have evidence that these sorts of crises are also associated with higher domestic violence, higher teenage pregnancy, higher child marriage. So there are real consequences. If I can complement what Raghu said, because I agree with him with the macro issues, the context is really important, and understanding the how can be as important as the what. Crisis management is like suddenly trying to drink from 3 fire hoses all at the same time. What the world is imposing on you, what your internal conditions are imposing on you, and then what's being demanded on you by the political system, etc. So we've learned quite a bit about crises. And I'd like just to say 4 things that is really important for anybody, whether you are in government or whether you are in a company, to remember. One is the first phase of crisis management is don't sacrifice the good for the best. Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. But people then tend to forget that the second rule that goes with it very quickly is continuously learn and adapt. You will make mistakes in crisis management. The key is to learn what these mistakes are quickly and adapt so that you have a more dynamic approach. The second lesson is what I call regret minimization. Be very clear on what mistakes you can afford to make and what mistakes you cannot afford to make. As Raghu illustrated with the restaurant, some mistakes are recoverable, others are not. And understanding that is really important. Third On this, respect the capital structure, because there is a time after the crisis, and what you do will be remembered. I say it's not enough to win the war. It's also important to establish the peace. And the lesson you learn, including from the global financial crisis, is that we're good at winning the war, but we're very bad at establishing the peace. And therefore, we come out more vulnerable and we don't recover fully. And then finally, keep an eye on the operational and behavioral mistakes that people repeatedly make. Adjustment fatigue is an example. People think it's a one-round game in game theory. I'm sorry to use, this is not a game, but the mindset is, if I just get this right now, I don't have to worry again. No, it's a multi-round reaction function. People think that precision is possible. Precision is not possible. This is about scenarios. People think that communication isn't that important. Communication is critical to keep your stakeholders. People underestimate all the time how difficult it is to keep going at this. So have a process to make sure that you keep on asking the relevant questions. These behavioral mistakes are often what distinguishes good crisis management from bad crisis management. Thank you.
No, fully agreed on communication. It's when you're fighting fires, you really don't think about communication, but at the end of the day, you really need to explain to the public what you are doing, why you are doing, to get the buy-in and so on. So I cannot agree more on the role of communication. What also complicates the life in many of the developing economies is the large share of informality. We're talking about 70% of at least employment in informal sector, and that makes it very difficult to target and provide the stimulus. We have been looking very carefully in, like you said, in terms of keeping livelihoods, making sure that those in the informal sector also participate in social transfer programs for livelihoods, and then at the recovery stage, make sure help them with assets so they can get back to speed. One of the key issues we have been looking at, of course, a lot of the informal sector is also in rural areas. So looking at digital technology, which if anything, I think from this crisis comes out as something that countries desperately need, both in terms of connectivity, but also in order to transact, in order to have digital financial services. So these are really, including insurance, micro-insurance, microfinance, and so on. So really areas where we have been focusing on. You mentioned health and education, Mohammed, very dear to our heart at the World Bank. You're right. I mean, this crisis can set decades back in many of the countries. We're lucky in advanced economies and some other relatively more developed countries to be able to have education online. For many countries, that's not a possibility, and that really sets back human capital. And that's why in the analytical work, the scars also relate to these legacy concerns about losing human capital and erosion of human capital and the implications of that going forward. You both mentioned, you mentioned respecting capital structure, Mohammed, and Raghu, I think you also mentioned private sector, Mohammed, and Raghu, you mentioned about bankruptcies and debt. How do you see the role of the, because many countries, both sovereigns and corporates have borrowed, both from the commercial sector, from private creditors. We have both IMF and the World Bank have called for a debt standstill, and this was endorsed by the G20 for the poorest countries, because we thought there is a time needed to really assess what's going on, and it's very important to provide the fiscal space to these countries to address many of the issues that we have been discussing. What do you see as next steps in terms of the discussion on, can we discuss a little bit on this debt? As you know, you all know very well, we started this at a very fragile, exposed levels of debt, very high risk of distress in many countries. This, of course, puts much more on top of that, as you also, both of you mentioned, what are your thoughts as to what is next? What is the role for the global community? What is the role for the World Bank potentially and other IFIs? And what is the role for the private sector? Whoever wants to go first, please.
Okay, let me take a crack, Mohammed. Um, Look, I think that what has been done by the World Bank, the IMF, as well as the G20 in terms of uh, placing a moratorium on debt payments, official sector debt payments, I think is very valuable. But we have to talk about what the next step is. Clearly, what is needed by many of these countries in the first phase of the fight, as Mohammed said, you're seeing rampant infections now in a number of countries, and with only a fraction of the medical facilities of advanced countries, this is going to be it's already a humanitarian catastrophe. It's going to become much worse. And you just have to see the galloping numbers in some countries to understand that we're not seeing even a fraction of the story. I mean, the death rates, yeah, we see some number, but those probably are underreported. We saw some of the images from Ecuador, and there's a lot more of this coming. So these countries need resources first to fight the virus, to prevent permanent damage to both their people as well as their companies. This is even in the relief phase before even we get to the repair phase. And they also need the ability to get more testing equipment, to get low cost respiratory structures so that they don't need necessarily sophisticated ventilators, but at least oxygenating machines and so on. They need a lot of that. And so we need a far greater effort at making sure they have the resources, and that those resources can actually buy this equipment at a reasonable price. That requires global coordination, including coordinated purchasing, etc., from where that is available. That is step one. And I think unless we also put a standstill on private sector payments, the worry is some of these countries still think that they will have the ability to access markets if they're good and nice, and they will continue servicing their private sector debt, even if it comes at the expense of fighting the disease, fighting the pandemic. So I think more effort, not just voluntary, but pushing very hard for a more structured process through which private sector payments are halted by the poorest countries for a period, so that no country has a stigma of defaulting individually, but that the public sector benefit doesn't go out through the back door to the private sector. And of course, more coordination on trying to help them buy the necessary equipment and get the necessary resources. That seems to me the first step. Of course, beyond that, we have to think about what happens when their damaged economies have to start confronting the reality that they have built up debt over time, and many of the corporations have debt, and that with trade down, with tourism down, with remittances down, with that the engines for growth are actually severely crippled. And of course, many of these countries used to rely on the external side for growth, and now even that is unlikely to emerge in the short to medium run. So we really have to think about debt restructuring over the medium term. But I think the first thing is to make sure they have enough resources. Let me stop here.
So let me complement Raghu and try and make 4 points. One, like him, I really welcome what the G20, what the World Bank, what the IMF have done. It was very important, it was very timely, and it wasn't easy because it involves non-traditional official creditors like China. So this is a big step. Second, I also endorse the urgency involved to make sure that this is the first step of a multi-step process. And this was made really stark with me. Raghu and I were on a call a few weeks ago where the conversation was, what happens if we get an infection outbreak in Africa? And one of our colleagues in Africa said the following: you have to understand that if we get an infection outbreak, we don't have the tools you have. So we will have to choose between dying from the infection or dying from hunger. And that, I think, has stuck with me. Which leads to the third issue. What the official sector has done is necessary but not sufficient. Raghu pointed out that more needs to be done in terms of the relief effort, vaccine distribution, testing, everything, ventilators. The whole of Zimbabwe has 5 ventilators. Just think about that. And of course, you need the private sector involvement. So from a top down, I don't think there's any doubt that the private sector has a role to play and must play a role. It is the bottom up that gets really complicated because you're dealing with 3 failures. One is institutional failure. The plan is not just a handful of banks. There's no natural conductor within the private sector. So you get massive institutional coordination failure. You're also dealing with the legacy of market failure. Too many entities, both sovereign and companies, were allowed to borrow in a world that was pushing capital towards them, and they overborrowed. And then the third failure you're dealing with is one of sustainability, where the growth model itself has become uncertain. Raghu is absolutely right. We need a different growth model. We don't know how quickly we're going to converge to that. So the country by country approach is going to have to be very clear on solvency versus liquidity, because let's not forget markets remain open for those who can access them. So you've got to be really clear in your mind, and I'm sorry about the dog, you have a solvency issue, not a liquidity issue. Secondly, to the extent you can, orderly and voluntary. Third, a menu approach is needed to bring in as many private creditors as possible. And finally, don't fall for the easy ways of debt equity, okay? But think very seriously about the new techniques that we have in order to facilitate orderly restructuring. Let me stop there.
Yes, thank you both. This is really a difficult topic, as you said, because not only it's difficult to know what liquidity and solvency is, we will be in a gray zone for a while until we understand the depth and breadth of this crisis. So the idea with the standstill was to also take the time to assess how bad this will get and what will be the implications. And also at the same time work on a menu approach, like you said, with the institutional characteristics as well as the potential instruments that can be used as needed as we understand better what we will be facing going forward. And I think the coordination failure is very well taken, and I do think we need a different, you talked about growth model, we also need a different debt model going forward, much more standardized, much more transparent, and with as much as possible institutional features that make it, that it help countries with some resilience as they go through cycles. So I think these will be all very critical issues to work on. In terms of, you know, you mentioned 5 ventilators, but there are also really difficult statistics in terms of number of hospital beds, for example, 4,000 people. These are really remarkable if you look at, if you compare with advanced economies, which have more than 4 beds, 4,000 people, and developing economies, you don't even have 1 bed, 4,000, let alone many of the issues that discussed. The bank actually came up with a very innovative approach in terms of stepping up support and offering a new procurement option to help countries access critically needed medical supplies, and really working as a facilitator without charging any additional fees, and really trying to support countries for global procurement. And that has been a very critical initiative at the bank, as well as the programs I mentioned in terms of providing immediate support to countries to deal with the health conditions. But of course, there is so much going on, and with the informal sector, and many of the countries are not used to, are working in, it's very difficult. Social distancing becomes very difficult in many countries when you live in slums, or when you don't have access to water and sanitation, when you don't have ability to produce or have logistics in terms of the way that can incorporate social distancing. All that will require time, and I think a lot of financial and technical assistance. I'd like to now start coming to questions that we already received, some from online, and there may be some coming already. But I will start with one question in terms of, when you look at the financial markets, and both of you mentioned that some countries are able to access markets. The markets are differentiating, but some are able to access them. So, but it seems like the financial markets and the real economy are in a disconnect right now. From where I sit, it looks like if we have such deep short-term and long-term problems, it's difficult to understand why the markets, of course, there are trillions of money being put into the system, but still, it seems there's a disconnect. So it would be good to hear from you, because many of the countries, developing economies that we work with, are really reliant on capital flows. So is this a phase which is a temporary phase, or what should we expect in terms of the developments in the financial markets?
Let me go first, and not put Raghu again in a difficult position I put him in previously, and he was so gracious in going first. What's happening in the marketplace, and this massive disconnect, while uncomfortable, is completely rational. And it's rational because of the mindset that the marketplace has adopted, which has been reinforced by data points. And the mindset is what I call the win-win. So the mindset in the marketplace is, the marketplace looks through short-term shocks and to the long term. And it is betting on a recovery. And short-term indicators that the reopening so far in most of the advanced world have been relatively smooth, without massive spikes in infection and hospitalization, reinforces this notion that the right thing to do is to look through the short-term data. But this would not have yielded the outcomes we have today: ever rising stock prices and markets wide open to virtually any issuers. We've had over $1 trillion of issuance in the last few months, a record pace. And what makes that possible is the second notion of win. It doesn't matter if I'm wrong, according to the marketplace. Because the Federal Reserve in particular has done something that was unthinkable. Not only has it supported market functioning, not only has it reduced liquidity risk, but it has come down to reduce credit risk and to reduce default risk. And how has it done that? By deploying its balance sheet in a seemingly endless way when it comes to scale and scope. And the notion that the Federal Reserve is buying high-yield bonds is historic. I mean, this people will look back on and say, you mean it bought J.C. Penney? It bought Hertz, both of which are in bankruptcy procedure. It did, because it bought the index. The minute you provide short Federal Reserve support for the low side of the capital structure, high yield, the next stage is emerging markets and equities. And people feel very comfortable that they will benefit either directly or indirectly from that. So this is a massive liquidity-driven rally that can go on for a while unless you get either major capital impairments or a policy mistake. They have unintended consequences and collateral damage. And two in particular, the marketplace is completely distorted right now. So the allocation of capital from the way the users apply it and the way the suppliers behave is completely distorted, and distorted in a way that will eat away at productivity and dynamism. Secondly, the signaling role played by prices, by market prices, is right now almost meaningless. And these two things are key to the good functioning of a market economy. So, as much as the marketplace has embraced and believes that the Fed is their BFF, their best friend forever, if you play this forward, there is concern as what happens to market efficiency down the road.
I really don't have anything to add to that masterful statement. So I fully associate myself with Mohammad's views. We can go to something else.
So what do you think countries, emerging market countries, should do? I mean, look, maybe India. Maybe we can talk about the response from India. There was a question from the floor actually asking, how well does it balance the lives versus livelihoods trade-off? Is there a danger that crisis will lead to economic repression and stagflation? I guess taking India as an example, but more broadly, many countries they will benefit, of course, from the liquidity from advanced economies, but not as much. So yeah, what can emerging markets and developing economies do?
Well, I mean, that's a great question. I mean, taking off from what Mohammad said, I mean, in terms of distortions, what this is doing is certainly on the one hand, suggesting that the search for yield is going to be supported. But it's also creating distortions between different forms of credit risk, right? So on the one hand, the search for yield within industrial countries will be supported through central bank support. That may spill over to other risky instruments across the world, including emerging market debt. But if it comes to choosing between the two, if there is again a flight to safety, a flight to away from risk, clearly where you will go is more industrial country risk rather than emerging market risk. So in a sense, the enormous balance sheet capacities of the industrial countries is creating a somewhat unlevel playing field across the world. Now, there's nothing to fault here. This is natural. They will do it because they're trying to support their economies. But this distortion is something that could play out down the line. Initially, it has helped because we've seen some of the risk aversion vis-a-vis emerging markets has dissipated in the last couple of months. Prices there have recovered along with the rest of the world. But if anything goes down going forward, clearly these sectors will be vulnerable. Now, the problem I see with emerging markets is that the few that have gone out on a limb to do the repair as well as relief, a country like Brazil, for example, has suffered. I mean, not entirely because of this. Of course, there are issues with the presidency and so on. But nevertheless, you look at the real depreciated by 30%. You look at credit default swaps for Brazilian debt, they have blown out relative to some other countries where they've maintained more austerity, done less relief. Probably will suffer more over the medium term because more of the entities will get into trouble. But they've sort of been investors find them potentially more credible. And so this is a little bit of the worry that we are in many countries doing short-term, medium-term damage in order to maintain access to markets. And you can't fault that, but it's sort of the kind of constraint that countries are laboring under. I mean, in India, um, turns out that the massive, 10% of GDP package that was announced by the Prime Minister, studies on what it truly means in terms of fiscal support is about 1%. A lot of the package is really liquidity support, and liquidity support that nobody's taking up. So some of it is support in terms of credit, additional credit that may be used. Again, that has to be designed well. But the reality is, and again, this is really the what is playing out. You're caught between the worry that you will be downgraded, the worry that there will be fiscal dominance, the worry that markets may turn against you, against the very real need that resources are needed to support existing households as well as industry. And the point that Mohammed made is very stark in India. A lot of 50% of households in a survey reported skipping a meal. This is in India today, where we thought hunger and starvation were banished. And so I think these are very real concerns. There are very real trade-offs, and you can play it either way. My sort of preference would be to focus on repairing and enhancing the economy rather than preserving sort of the image with investors, while doing everything over the medium term to convince investors this is both in their interest as well as in the economy's interest. It's in nobody's interest to see a devastated household sector, a devastated small and medium industry sector, and to have riots in the streets. That's in nobody's interest. And so I think there's a way to communicate, and this goes back to your earlier point. Communication is so important on what you're trying to do, what broad framework this fits in, and why investors should be supportive of this rather than counting every rupee that you spend for relief as well as repair. Let me stop there.
It becomes, of course, difficult as one is trying to make decisions in a context of a lot of uncertainty, but fully agreed. I think really trying to put, for each country, this is going to be different, but as we were discussing before, really understanding the context and coming up with ways of restructuring and perhaps, and this is what I'd like to end with, we have about 7 minutes left, what good can come out of this crisis? We always, there's the Chinese proverb everyone talks about, or the letters mean, part of it means crisis and part of it is actually opportunity. So is there a way to expect some positive out of this crisis? How can, this is devastating, it's humanitarian crisis and so on. But at the same time, there will be the time after. What is it that countries can do to get good outcomes at the end of this? We have usually, we have reforms that can help remove distortions, allow competition, bring in the private sector, and really focus efforts into areas where there can be productive investments, allocate resources efficiently. Digital we talked about, but really would be great to hear from both of you as to how and when is it the time, what are the steps to really try to recover better from this crisis? What are some thoughts?
Mohammed, go ahead.
I maintain on my desk a list of what I call silver linings. And there's nothing that I want to do better than bottle them and keep them for the next phases of repair and stimulate, as Raghu said. Let me list a few because they all benefit developing countries if we bottle them. One is we're seeing massive innovation in medicine. We're seeing leapfrogging go on, and that can help enormously in many developing countries. Two is we're seeing focus on what are the market failures that get in the way of having better PPEs in developing countries, having better vaccine distribution. There's a market failure mindset that means that you can focus your resources on the one or two things that have massive beneficial effects. Third, there's greater sensitivity to tail risks. What this pandemic has made people realize is that low probability events have devastating effects, and you have to think about not just the probability of them happening, but the severity of the effect. And my hope is that you'll see what happens typically in the private sector after a flood, when the demand for flood insurance goes up. Even though the cost has gone up, that there's sensitivity. Why? Because climate change. I don't even think it's a tail risk. I think it's a baseline risk. But developing countries are particularly exposed to climate change. Another one, and I'll stop in a minute, is we're seeing much better public-private partnerships. And I think that developing countries can learn from good public-private partnerships. We're also seeing recognition of global coordination failures. And if someone suffers the most in a global coordination failure, it is the most vulnerable segments. And it is the developing countries. And finally, we are seeing the private sector get more social conscious, realizing that their own stakeholders, their own employees want them to care. And again, that can be a very positive thing. So thank you for ending on this. There's lots of silver linings. And I think one of the challenges for us all in not just winning the war, but establishing a piece of inclusive and sustainable growth is to bottle these things up and make sure they don't go away as soon as the crisis moment passes. Thank you.
Before you go, Mohammed, what is, and I'm going to ask you the same question, Raghu. How do you see the role of the World Bank in all this? These silver linings. How would you like to see the World Bank react?
I think the World Bank has all the attributes to make it the trusted advisor, to make it a great place a clearing place where information is brought together and distributed. A lot of countries are trying to figure things out. And there's one advantage of being the third phase of an infection is there's a lot of learning that has gone on in phase 1 and phase 2. I see the World Bank playing a critical role, as I noted earlier, along with the IMF, in coordinating the private sector response to this. And I see the World Bank through the IFC playing a very important role in public-private partnerships. So there's massive role for the bank, but the bank has also to show that it is willing to adapt how it does things. It is willing to look at data. Raghu and I today look at data that 3 months ago I didn't even know existed. Mobility data to judge are consumers engaging in the economy or not. You need to go back and say, yes, I'm the information bank, but the information I'm looking at is evolving because the world is evolving really quickly. Thank you.
Thanks, Mohammed. And I believe that one of the things this crisis has done is accentuate the older problems. It's made every division that was earlier worse. And at one level, you may think that's terrible, and it may well be. But at another, this may be the straw that breaks the camel's back and basically says, look, there's no way that we can go back to the old ways. We need change. I mean, you can see that, for example, in the debate that's going on within the United States, the tragic events of the last few days, but more generally, the sense that inequality of the kind that had been emerging, a lot of it, I believe, because of technological change, that we somehow have to find new ways to address it. And if we are to have sustainable growth, and a number of papers, including by people at the IMF as elsewhere, are suggesting that inequality in incomes may in fact be a big factor in the secular stagnation that we have seen, in our difficulty to ramp up growth without ramping up the imbalances in a really big way. And that's what is making us more vulnerable to crisis after crisis. So if that is a more accepted view as we go forward, then we need to find ways to tackle that inequality, not just through redistribution, but by fundamentally changing the opportunity set that people have. And I think that if we can see that change happening over the next decades, that will be really important for a more sustainable world. More short term, I mean, certainly the plight of the emerging markets and developing countries will refocus our attention on issues of trade, immigration, capital flows, and perhaps we will pay more attention to what the new global order should look like, in order that not just the industrial world, but also the emerging and developing world benefit tremendously from openness. And that dialogue has to be had. I think it's critically important both for the aging developed world as well as the young emerging world in Africa and elsewhere, but it needs to be had. And I hope leadership in the United States and elsewhere will make that possible. Mohammed has already talked about technology, but I want to end with one last point. What the pandemic has done is it has been relentless in exposing bad management, bad government. And so, to that extent, it has helped in making people aware of the true qualities of the government they are led by. Now, sometimes that helps in making for change. Sometimes it leads to even more repression as governments understand they've lost legitimacy. But big events like these do create the possibility of change. And I'm hopeful that we will use it to move the world in a much more positive direction, given that where we were heading before the pandemic was unsustainable and unpleasant. Last point, I mean, you made the you asked the question about the World Bank. The World Bank I absolutely has to play a role as a source for ideas about how we can go forward. And so creating the frameworks for the new dialogue, asking what the world should look like to deal with problems of trade, the issues related to immigration, the issues related to climate change, the tail risk that we've become much more aware of. All this is something the World Bank could play a much bigger role if it is given the right environment in which to play that role. And for that, I think the major countries have a great responsibility post-crisis to create that environment, starting, of course, with the United States. Let me stop there.
Thank you so much to both of you. A big thank you to all those that have tuned in as well. Please feel free to share it with the conversation. We will make the recording available on World Bank Live. This was a great discussion, Raghu, Mohammed. I really took some good ideas, and you mentioned, both of you, in many ways, the role for the bank as the trusted advisor, as coordinating responses through our IFC and MEGA arms, really helping the private sector, high frequency monitoring, which we are doing regularly to also understand the pulse of for the poverty and so on. And of course, in the key areas of sustainable development, which is sustainable and inclusive development, key priority for us. So thank you so much for the great discussion. And thanks to everyone. We will stop here. We're already a few minutes past our allocated time, but I really think this gives us a lot of food for thought, and we need to take action. So thank you very much and have a great day. Bye-bye.